Welcome to Talk Cosmos, the show where Sue Rose Minahan and guests unveil astrology's ancient archetypes that continually build the collective experiences in our unconsciousness. Get ready to find your free will from your roots in the stars.
Hello, this is my introduction. Tonight is November 14th, 2020, and we are discussing a most amazing epic, the first existing story actually that was written, because it was during that cradle of civilization between the Euphrates and rivers, and in Sumeria, thousands of years ago, called Gilgamesh, a ruler that has been determined to have lived about in Europe as UK, and it was about 4,000 BC. Actually, some of my facts are a little bit off, so it's about 4,000 years ago. But the point is that what I was taking from my notes is that cities began about 4,000 BC. And so writing began about 3,500 BC. And that is like 5,500 years ago. And so the oldest existing versions of this poem date to about 2000 BC. In Sumerian, it was cuneiform. It has all the elements of a true, not just a narration and a poem, but of epic dimensions, giving us so many seeds of eternal thought. And I could go on for a long time about it, but yet that's the basis of this talk. And I have a most wonderful guest tonight, Susanna Lowbeer. I am so sorry again. I need to get centered here. And Susanna is a healing artist, an alchemical creator, and a Renaissance woman, being an acupuncturist, a silversmith, potter, baker, and musician. Now that's a handful. In this multifaceted approach to her life's work through the lens of healing, Susanna's deep interest in astrology and passion for all things mythological and magical. Susanna has explored astrology, mythological astronomy, and astrological talisman crafting under the expert guidance of Gemini Brett, who has been on the program quite a few times and is actually following Susanna next week. Susanna married her love of astrology, metalsmithing, and gemology by creating these bespoke astrological talismans. These are very ancient and, in a sense, really speaks to the story that we're talking about as stone legends, and she and I will bring that up to recap, really. Susanna believes life is art, and an art is healing. And whether crafting a talisman or teacup, performing acupuncture, baking bread, or playing music, the energy and attention is the same. And you can reach Susanna at susannaarts.com. She lives down in Portland. Hello, Susanna.
Hi.
Yeah, it's so
great to be here.
It is. And we met at that illustrious moment with Gemini Brett at the Great American Eclipse back in August of 2017. And it's most remarkable that now, here tonight, will be later here on the West Coast at 17 minutes to midnight, will be the new moon in Scorpio, all about death and rebirth of our phases, and that we're talking about Gilgamesh, who was actually, his great drive was essentially, in the long run, about fear of death.
It's true. Immortality, a quest for immortality.
Yeah, I know. It's so absolutely astounding that it makes a real connection, I'm saying, to our legacy of the consciousness, because this elusive factor of our spirit connected with nature and God and our physical body has been perhaps tormenting humanity since the essence of time. You know, it's part of our real thought. The story. Perhaps you want to begin with a little bit of what this story actually involves.
Sure. I'd love to give a quick summary. Of course, it is an epic, so that's always an interesting thing to try to give a quick summary of an epic tale. But I think it's actually worth just reading. I would love to read just like the first little stanza of it. This is from the translation that I have by Andrew George, I believe. This is also what's called the standard version. And the reason I wanted to share it is just because it's kind of like introducing us into the world. So it goes, he who saw the deep, the country's foundation, who knew was wise in all matters. Gilgamesh, who saw the deep, the country's foundation, who knew was wise in all manners. And then after a few more stanzas, it goes and it gives instruction to climb Uruk's wall and walk back and forth. Survey its foundations, examine the brickwork. Were its bricks not fired in an oven? Did the 7 sages not lay its foundations? So we're called to meet Gilgamesh, this hero, and to observe this wall, which he is given credit for building throughout the epic. One more thing I wanted to point out just to get started is that when it talks about Gilgamesh and his stories, actually, when you are instructed to read the story, it says, read out the travails of Gilgamesh, and that all that he went through, which to me speaks to the fact that even though he was a glorious warrior, he suffered a great deal, and that his story can be summed up in suffering and travails. So even though these glorious deeds that we are told about him did happen, there's also this interesting thing. So to basically sum up, Gilgamesh was the king of Uruk, but he was abusing his powers and was doing things that were not very nice to his people. One of the main things he was doing was sleeping with the wives of men before they got a chance on their wedding day. On their wedding night, he would sleep with them first. So apparently some of the people thought this really needs to stop. And so the gods created a man who was his equal, because Gilgamesh was a great warrior and very strong, and they created a man out in the wild on the steppe named Enkidu, who would be his equal. And essentially Enkidu, who was a wild man on the steppe, is then tamed by a harlot from the city of Uruk and comes down into the city and challenges Gilgamesh. And they fight together and wrestle and brawl until they mutually see each other for being equals and brothers and become the very best of friends and go on a lot of adventures. Mainly, they decide to go and conquer the Humbaba, the god of the cedar forest. They, harvest a bunch of trees from the cedar forest, and they build a temple in the city walls, and they also kill the bull of heaven, which is sent by Ishtar, who makes a pass at Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh turns her down, and so she gets the bull after him, and then she is defeated, or the bull is defeated by Gilgamesh and Enkidu, and then Enkidu actually falls ill. He's not defeated in battle, he's not hurt by any of the monsters, but he actually falls ill and dies of illness. And then Gilgamesh really comes face to face with what mortality looks like, and it's not pretty, and he gets very scared. Gilgamesh, who was never scared of anything before, is scared to death of dying, and he goes wandering, and he goes on a quest. He's heard of this sage at the end of the world named Utanapishti, who has the secret to immortality. He himself has become immortal. He's a man that's become immortal because he survived the Great Flood. And so after a lot of adventures through the wilderness, he eventually reaches Uttanapishti, and basically, I'm sure we'll get into more of all the details of this whole story. I'm really summing up a lot, but Uttanapishti tells him that, you're not gonna, immortality is not for you, and he's rejected, and so he ends up leaving and coming back to where he started in Uruk, and the entire epic actually wraps up with the same verses. That's basically like, here we are on the city walls, and here's, it's kind of, again, it's like a beautiful spiral of a story that kind of ends up in the same exact place that it started, with this kind of sense of like, well, I mean, I don't want to say futility. It's not futile at all, but there is a kind of sense of like, climb Uruk's wall back and forth, survey the foundations, examine the brickwork.
Yeah.
It's kind of like nothing has changed. Everything, really beautiful story in that way as well.
Well,
but that is a very, I skipped a lot of my favorite parts of the story because I wanted to try to get all the main points. And
Susanna, I appreciate the synopsis because it is involved and there is a theme. All stories have a theme of as far as a plot, right? And so this is good. And so much came out. And whenever I think of the walls, because there's, many times this is brought up, the bricks that we built. And to me, really, it constitutes the foundation. What is the foundation of your whole purpose? And often, in the story, there's dreams that are related, and the gods talk to either Gilgamesh or to Enkidu, and describing, well, what is your purpose? Why are you doing this? When you have this or you have that. And so, of course, as humanity, people concern this. But, so when you said about abuse powers, I think to myself, here he was given, according to the rendition I read, the George is, I think, one of the primary important ones to read in its full verse. He was the one that really, I think, first translated all this. But I read various ideas of it, and then I finally read Sanders, which is more of her verbalization of it, but it gives a lot of the ideas. And okay, about the abuse of powers, is that he was given, again, from the gods, Shumash, the sun, this great strength and beauty, and not to teach all the different gods, of course, that they had at that period of time. But for what purpose? Because if he was doing it just for his own self, seeding the women of his children, not being, as they said, the shepherd over protection of his people, that it really shows the first descent of humanity's consciousness going, yes, lead us, but for what purpose? And for what purpose? Like, are we building temples just for the spirit of gods, or are we part of gods? And, all these questions.
And I think that really speaks also to the ways in which quote unquote civilization can lead to an abuse of power, how power can become, an end in itself, and it leads more to self-aggrandizement and corruption. And I believe that that's one of these ancient stories that we're obviously facing today. It's no less relevant now, obviously, how power can corrupt and how people can become power hungry and really just get out of control and lose their sense of morality and, caring for their people, caring, especially someone like a king like Gilgamesh. And it is really fascinating how this wild man, Enkidu, from the wilds, who in my mind actually represents, or really literally is, our ancient nomadic ancestors. That Enkidu is a hunter-gatherer tribes person from the steppe, which is like this semi-nomadic hunter-gatherer population. And there's a lot of really interesting details in the story that support that idea, and that his creation was a way for Gilgamesh's power to come into balance.
Yes.
And how important that is, and how important it is for nature and the power of our natural world and the natural systems to be able to find a balance to culture, especially when culture itself kind of gets out of control and out of balance.
Yes, there was a part there that said, as Enkidu was, quote, started the process of civilization, and the way, of course, they did it was the merging of a feminine goddess, the energies of lovemaking, and therefore the deep intimacies that are shared through that, through learning to think more and not so instinctive, but eating, and they said too symbolically, like the bread of life and the drink of merriment, with the wine and all of that, which disassociated him from the very instinctual essence of nature. And this crops up again and again about so many themes that have since, when you think about it, come up with religion, come up with stories. It's just incredible. It's like this is the seed story of everything, like do unto others as you do unto yourself. I mean, brotherhood, that's supposed to be, or this whole interaction between the female and the male, that if you leave the instinctive parts of nature and get these roles, and then again, it's not just in the physical, it's really, you can begin to think, is it really more the energetic, the solar, the lunar, the receptive, the aggressor part of all of us, of creation, but yet it's manifested in this female. And of course, there's a certain part where there's great lamentation later when he dies. Oh, it was, look what they did to me, which is interesting that Enkidu would feel that way, because it somehow it not only is he part of the nature, but it seems like he's also kind of a mix of the retaliation, or not the higher self of us, because even Gilgamesh had some compassion, but then he listened, and of course he killed Humbaba, the protector of the forest.
Mm-hmm. One more thing I want to say about Enkidu and his creation, which I find fascinating, is that there's a couple times when he's, I guess Gilgamesh has a dream about Enkidu coming, and I'll quote again from Andrew George. It says, "The stars of the heavens appeared before me like a rock from the sky. One fell down before me. I lifted it up, but it weighed too much for me. I tried to roll it, but I could not dislodge it." And that is really fascinating, because it sounds like a meteor, doesn't it?
Yes.
And that is really fascinating to me, to think about how Enkidu is some type of star being in a way, or a comet, or a meteor, and I don't really know what to make of that. And I feel like I'd love to research it more. I was kind of, but it really stuck out and made a lot of sense in certain ways, that he would be represented in this dream in this way. And I just wanted to also highlight how fascinating dreams are, the role that the dream plays in this entire story. It comes again and again as these moments. And particularly fascinating to me is the sequence of dreams that Gilgamesh has when Enkidu and Gilgamesh are on their way to the cedar forest. Because Gilgamesh has a whole series of dreams that have to do with the upcoming battle with Humbaba. But one of the things I wanted to just share that I find very fascinating is that Enkidu actually builds a temple. I would say it's not actually a physical temple exactly, but it is a special enclosure in which Gilgamesh lays down to dream. And this really speaks to a very ancient sacred practice that was something for the ancient Greeks, the ancient Egyptians, as well as the Sumerians and Babylonians, were these sleep temples and dream temples. And this is just such a fascinating area of study that I would really love to delve into more. But I would just say in the context of this, that the power of dream and the power of sleep was very, very, very sacred to these ancient people. So again, reading from George, and this is, I think, marked as tablet 4, number 170. It says, Enkidu made for Gilgamesh a house of the dream god. He fixed a door in its doorway to keep out the weather. In the circle he had drawn, he made him lie down, and falling flat like a net, lay himself in the doorway. So I just wanted to share that because I think that that is so powerful. And I think that that practice of dream and sleep in a sacred enclosure and the prophetic nature of dream was very important to ancient people. And it is really inspiring to think about how even in this epic, this old epic, as well as thinking about them being out in the wilderness, they weren't like in an actual temple, but how they created, it was almost like a mobile temple that they were able to create a sacred, or like a vision quest almost or something, you know, it's like this sacred enclosure where they had these dreams. So I just wanted to share that as a really interesting piece.
You know, like the Delphi, the Oracle of Delphi, I believe in Greece was where people would go and they would stay the night and they would receive a dream. And so this whole energy gets carried further and further. Our society, maybe we're so busy, I think, with interruptions and things that we think are permanent, because the end of the story mentions with the wisdom, you know, when he goes to search for the everlasting life, he is told that really that the world is impermanent, meaning that it's in a constant flux, that what we do isn't always here. And so our lives are like the gods are going to be eternally in that energy, but our lives here are transitory, but meaning like he wanted to leave his mark. And so he did in the stone. He left a story in a stone. And of course, earlier he crushed all the sacred stones. And I'm thinking that's a lot like the talismans that you make, that actually from way past, you know, when we think about it, Hammurabi, or I'm not saying if I'm saying his name right, but the law of Hammurabi in ancient Greece, it was in that formulated a lot of the cohesive ideas of civilized law, you know, so that people could get along. But it's a way of caring further. And the last thought, thinking of stones, because that brings back again the meteorite or meteor. From the star comes this rock that comes to Earth. And in Sanders' edition, she has a prologue, and she went on to say that it was too heavy, but nobles would kiss its feet, and the attraction was like the love of a woman. And that has been questioned many times. It comes up, but yet I'm thinking it's that missing part of Gilgamesh. Here he's made like the greatest warrior and can overcome everybody and lead, but is he leading really in the right way? It's such a classic Leo sense. And you know, like you were saying, manifestation without heart, without compassion for who we're leading, that other part, the seventh, you know, of the horoscope. So perhaps that's what that whole relationship was, is that because there is indication they became brothers through the mother, who was also a goddess and would say, care for Gilgamesh like a brother.
And one of the other aspects of
your voice is losing,
which I find really fascinating. They're both. Can you not hear me?
Yeah, it's sort of distorted sometimes. Try, that's better. Go ahead. Yeah.
They're both hybrids. So we have Gilgamesh, who is apparently 2/3 God and 1/3 human. And we have Enkidu, who is some percentage human and some percentage animal. And we're not really, there's not a huge specification about that, but nonetheless, there's that quality of each of them that has this commonality of humanness, where Enkidu is the animal part of human and Gilgamesh is the divine part of human. And then they kind of meet in their humanity and learn to become human together. I believe maybe Herbert Mason's translation, I'll double check, because that was another translation that I really enjoyed. And I think, oh yeah. So in Herbert Mason's translation, which is probably similar to Saunders in terms of it being a narrative that is just kind of knitted together in like a poetic story. So it's not a direct translation scholarly like George's. It's more of, but it's a very beautiful story. And so here's the first stanza of it. Says, Gilgamesh was the king of Uruk, a city set between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Babylonia. Enkidu was born on the steppe where he grew up among the animals. Gilgamesh was called a god and a man. Enkidu was an animal and a man. In this story, they become human together.
Yes.
And so that gave me chills when I read it. And I feel like that is kind of really a beautiful essence of their relationship and their kind of different facets of the human experience, and that their love for one another as brothers was that common humanity, and that they complemented each other in these different ways to like round themselves. They were kind of incomplete without one another, but their collective humanity kind of gave them a chance to grow into their humanness, whereas apart they were not.
That's perfect, Susanna. I think that's a actually ideal way to tie the essence of this together as we take a break. This is November 14th, the Scorpio new moon tonight, and we're talking about Gilgamesh, the first epic of immortality and the fear of death. As we transform, we'll be back. And I'm with Susanna Lowbeer of Portland. Thank you.
While we take a break from this week's edition of Talk Cosmos, let's take a look at this cycle's archetype. We are currently in the yin period of Scorpio, traditionally ruled by Mars, now ruled by Pluto. By departing a cycle based on comparison between extreme energies finding balance, Scorpio commits a relationship to exchange resources, experiencing power and powerlessness for the purpose of soul growth transformation. As a fixed water sign that is extreme, intense, and secretively deep, Scorpio's passionate nature questions the psychology and mystery concerning life and death.
Hello, this is Dr. Judith Safrir. I'm a holistic psychiatrist in the Boston area and an evolutionary astrologer. And you're listening to Talk Cosmos on Alternative Talk 1150 AM, where we discuss the meaningfulness of our roots in the stars.
Alternative Talk 1150, local talk for the body, mind, and soul.
Well, hello again. Yes, we're on this epic journey, and Susanna Lowbeer and myself. Susanna's at susannaarts.com, and of course you can go to Talk Cosmos and find that. And it's a perfect conversation because we're going through transformations and the questioning involved. So with Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk in Sumeria, with his friend Enkidu, which actually might be a parody, I don't know if a parody is the right word, but a takeoff of Enki, which is the god of wisdom, I believe. So it's like little wisdom. I wonder about, but they go on their journeys. I mean, as you were saying, Susanna, the Enkidu was created in order to match Gilgamesh, so that he could, and that isn't that the way we have? And we have first house, seventh house, where the seventh house complements and reflects, and it's me versus other, and then even there's that polarity between all of them. The greatness of Leo, of manifestation, is also for the service of the group, and etc. So these two, they go on this journey to the great forest. And just thinking with a previous meditation group that I'm in, that the forest, it represents the great mystery, doesn't it? It holds the great magical beings. It's that depth of unknown, but it's material. It's not like space you see things, you see trees, you see animals. So it's this embodiment, right? Yeah, of great mystery. So they go into it. Are you?
I'm there. How is is my headphones better?
Yeah, your headphones are better now. Yes. I didn't want to interrupt her before. It's great. Yes.
Yes, I found the aspect of the cedars and the cedars of Lebanon specifically one of the most fascinating aspects of the story. And I really was inspired to want to learn more about it, but feel like there's a precious little in terms of information online that I could research, at least in the last couple of weeks, about it. And so I was again inspired, feeling like this might be further study, because the cedars of Lebanon were very famous in the ancient world and used for temple building, ship building, incense offerings. They were very sacred trees, and they were very prized and precious. And I feel that, again, with Gilgamesh, it's such a fascinating story because I can say that there's no real clear answer in terms of morality. I think one of the things that our modern mind tries to do is to put things in boxes and say this is good or this is bad, or they should do this or they shouldn't do that. But I feel that Gilgamesh as an epic really challenges that. And at least for myself, I've really felt a struggle, because there's part of me, they were killing Humbaba, who had been put there by the gods to guard the cedar, because the cedar is sacred, and the forest itself is a temple, and the forest is a sacred place. And the idea that Gilgamesh just felt like it was a good idea to go out there and kill this monster and then take the cedars down. To me, there's this part of me, the nature loving, respecting the spirits of nature part of me, that felt very horrified about that. But at the same time, Enkidu, while he initially was hesitant to assist Gilgamesh, ended up helping him with this task. And then the fact that they did cut down all these trees and then go to build these walls and these temples for the gods with the trees, it's like they were using them in a way to exalt the glory of the gods. And yet the actual act of killing the monster and cutting the trees down was an insult. And so it's a very complex situation. Well, and one more thing I want to add about that before I close is that Enkidu on his deathbed has moments when he's having almost a conversation with the walls themselves, where he feels betrayed by the walls, because he's like, well, I put these walls up with these cedars, and why did I even bother? Because now they're kind of the death of me. And in a sense, he's right. And so I just wanted to add that also as another layer of complexity around this story.
It's deep. It's very deep, because the forest, from what I was reading, was of life and the resources, and there were splendors. There were 7 splendors of Humbaba, this great, terrible, and amazingly, when I say terrible, I'm repeating what I read, but in the human consciousnness, anything that was unsafe was really dreadful, which really, thinking about the primitiveness of forging out protection in our natural world is not something that really in the 21st century we're all thinking about, although there's definitely areas of the world where we do, and that. So, but it seems as though that there's a real clue there. I agree that looking through that confusion of the whole thing, because why did they go there? They went for their own glory. There was a lot of that. Gilgamesh wanted their names to live in eternity. And so there is, just like I remember with the Norse, one of the culturally strong features of ancient Norse was that cultures was that there was no greater honor than being at your deathbed and being hailed as a hero, and after you died, all the great poems that would be told about you. And it was so amazing to read this story and to see that generally that same theme is from the very roots at the beginning. Of course, the Celts that went to the Norse are very old and ancient too, so really looking at all that anthropology, thank you, but lamenting it. This is right. And as I read more about Enkidu, when he was in the forest, Humbaba actually pleaded with Gilgamesh, oh, spare me. He didn't say spare me, but he said, grant me my life, and I will be your servant, and I will build you these things. Which really, when I thought about it, when they're building temples to the gods, it's like, why don't they just live with the gods of the higher consciousness? But everything had to be materialized as though that life was the most important, and that's all where it lived. Instead of, like you were saying, in the forest, where they made their own temple, and in the simplicity of it, just using nature. So in other words, I think really in Enkidu, who in this merging of consciousness between, as you say, man, or we said man, animal nature, and man, God nature, which is actually all three, right? I mean, we're the full spectrum of humanity, was because Enkidu said, no, kill Humbaba and all his servants. And I wondered somewhat, was that out of jealousy? Because he was a servant to Gilgamesh, and maybe he didn't want somebody else being. They didn't say that. There's so much that's lost in translation, because to tell our listeners, these are from tablets from a library that was finally found by the British, that were in thousands and thousands of pieces. How they ever put them together, I don't know. And they're still missing a bunch of pieces. So the story is not complete. Are you there?
Yes, I am here. And I do feel like there is so much here. And especially the Cedar Forest episode, again, for me, really rings as a very important part of the whole story, because of that tension between, you know, the sacredness of nature and how the forest itself can be a temple, as we know. However, using those trees in a way, again, you know, I think about our humanness and our opposable thumbs and the things that we like to build, and those buildings being monuments. And that is a huge theme in Gilgamesh. I mean, again, just the beginning of our story with the walls and the bricks, you know, and then thinking about just the idea of a monument. And this is something that I think a lot of scholars and poets and other people have really latched onto in the story of Gilgamesh, is just the testament of poetry as a monument. And just kind of that interesting kind of tension is like, maybe even after all of the walls have been broken down by time, the story will still be told, and how the words themselves are like a monument and a story. Yes. And it's just interesting how that is kind of laid out in the poem itself, and how it's spoken. You know, it's like, look at these walls and hear this story. So I feel like even in those words, and it actually does come up throughout the whole epic itself, poetically, those ideas are being contrasted. They're being laid out before us and kind of displayed. And I feel, you know, again, thinking about Scorpio and the new moon, and just this energy of death and decay, and just thinking about immortality and the things that make us immortal. Is it a monument? Is it a physical structure? And is it something that we can actually make or build, or is it more of the energy of what's told? Is it more of a story, which is ultimately the thing, and that is, again, it's something that is really beautifully explored in the Gilgamesh epic, for sure.
Thank you. Absolutely. And when I think about it, that's where this written stone at the very end, he finally writes it in the stone. And whether that was added or how that was added, but the fact is that, yes, the story is what we can make and recreate. And what's amazing is that this story has lasted because there's essential parts of it, and that words are tools and symbols, and back to the forest. Okay, the god Enlil of wind, and was also one of creation, it seems much, that had gave after Gilgamesh killed Humbaba. Enlil was enraged, and he took the blaze, which I never quite understood what the blaze was, but I guess Humbaba had a blaze so there's a lot missing that still needs to be looked at, from like reading this, because it's not a quick study. It's like, oh my gosh, there's so much. But he took that blaze, and it said, and the 7 splendors, which were gone once Humbaba had been killed, and he gave the first to the river, the second to the lion, the third to the stone of execration of the mountain, and the third to the daughter of the queen of Hades, who is, I think, Ereshkigal. I could never say her name quite right. And again in this story, it seems like the eagle of Scorpio, the lion of Leo, the waters, well, the stone of Taurus, and then the river, of Aquarius, of the being poured. It's those 4. It's a fixed cardinals. I mean, not fixed cardinals. What am I saying? The fixed axis of the zodiac, and this energy that is repeated again and again, like one of the monsters, and I never really like to think of the word monster. Whenever I read now the word monster, I think, well, that's just a way to say that it's like an alien energy that's unfamiliar, because it had a hand like a talon of an eagle, and other features that are just abnormal, that we don't think of as normal. But is that wrong? It's so symbolic.
That is very symbolic, actually. Yeah. That really brings that idea of a monster, and the ancient origins of that word actually are interesting, because the original word itself wasn't necessarily something with negative connotations. It really actually more pointed to something that was a hybrid of other things. So yes, we think of that as, something like a griffin, it's like a magical animal, like a centaur or a griffin or something, or even just something that's a kind of an abomination, like something bad or scary. Mm-hmm. But in a lot of ways, we can think of Enkidu and Gilgamesh also as having those qualities of being hybrids of gods and humans, or animals and humans. So this idea of hybrids, and that concept of them being something monstrous and having that being a bad thing, it really has come down over many hundreds of years in our language as like having negative connotations, whereas initially the word itself and kind of some of the mythology around the word is not necessarily negative. And it's very interesting that the Catholics still have the monstrance, which is it's a relic that they look at. It's a vessel that's used in the church as an object of worship. And so it's a very interesting thing to look at that it's like a receptacle where the consecrated host is exposed for veneration. And that, again, it's kind of a side note, but it's also very fascinating to think about.
It is.
And especially in the context of this story where we have our two heroes as, in some ways monsters, because they were hybrid. They were beings that were not just human, not just God, but hybrids.
And as we had ended in the before the break, that you nicely put together, and that is so strong here in this story, is that I feel is really a purpose of it, is this unification of all our parts, and to understand our own place, because there is a legacy. There is obviously the word. It is a tool that it was always the oral word, and then it's the written word. And the written words might even get to be more difficult because it loses a lot of its symbolism. At that time, things, every word that we consider has such dimension to it. Now it's a whole process. What was I? Oh, again and again, I'm looking at this note, and I don't know if this was quite how this was verbalized in the actual translation, but it is, how shall I find the life for which I am searching? Now, isn't that really the essence of so many concerns and teachings, and addressed in so many different ways in our whole mentality, our consciousness, our heart, our soul? And, the old man that was with the flood, that managed to find the seeds of life and continue them, said there is no permanence. That.
Well, and that is so interesting in itself too, because I know that Gilgamesh, on his searching for immortality, especially after the death of Enkidu, when he was really afraid of corporeal death, that he was told by gods, as well as the innkeeper and others in the story, like, you will never find that life that you are seeking, that you are a human, and the gods gave humans death. They gave themselves immortality, and they gave humans mortality. And it's like this very clear, thing they're saying: you are a human, you have death, and you're seeking something that is not for you. And yet somehow the interesting part of it for me that I keep coming back to is, somehow through his seeking, he did achieve some type of immortality. Because we're talking about him right now.
Through the word, through the stone, through the story. And it is so strong. In fact, I go back to also Uric. He says that it was 1/3 garden, 1/3 city, 1/3 field, which is it was such a, so it was kind of balance in there. And that, and the tunnel. Remember when he is going to try to find, this isn't a linear conversation, folks. Because it is in depth, okay. So he meets Indiku, and then they go to the forest, kill Imbaba, and then they also kill the bull of the heavens, because Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, throws herself in this story. Now, interestingly, if we look at, and I didn't go back to the tunnel that I was going to talk about, because the point is they kill the bull of the heavens, and all this conquest, and partly Indiku supports strongly Gilgamesh against some of his own thinking of, because he is part God. It's like, well, should we do this? And the nature and the man that doesn't have in this, because they're not linking together nature and God together. Somehow they're separating all this in order to try to understand the instinctive with the higher consciousness, maybe of thought, bringing it into consciousness. And of course, Enkidu ends up being sacrificed as the one that has to die, because Shumash, the son, can only spare one. And Gilgamesh kept making all this vows and with the son, saying, I will follow you if you will protect me. So they go through the tunnel. He's following the paths of the sun through the darkness, 12 leagues. And as I listen to that, I think that is the horoscope. It's going from the houses, the 12 houses, back to where the sun rises again. It's just incredible. Now, whether that started at the fourth house and went, at the cusp of the IC and then comes up and goes around again because the death, I'm not sure where it goes. Oh boy, lots of threads here. I know I lost a few, but lead on.
Well, there's always going to be more threads to pick up, but I will say that one of the things that we haven't really touched on, which is so fascinating about this story, is that it is. Some people really believe it's kind of a living story linked to the pre-deluge story, because there is the story within the story when Gilgamesh makes it all the way out to the ends of the earth and meets Utanapishti to ask Utanapishti how to become immortal. Utanapishti starts to tell the story of the flood, and this is the first known story of the flood that is recorded, at least on tablet form. It is a very ancient, of course, the story of the flood is one of the most ubiquitous, powerful stories that we have as part of our early human mythology. And so, excuse me. And so I feel the story of the flood as told in Gilgamesh, the epic, is really, really it's like a link. I feel like Gilgamesh is kind of like a living link. And he's even portrayed that way in the literature and in the stories afterwards, that he's this kind of like speaking to Utanapishti, who was actually, the Noah character. He was the one that built the ark, which is actually described in very specific detail. And there's a lot of interesting scholarship that's kind of an offshoot about the type of boat, which people say is a round boat. I think it's called a coracle, which is another, again, this is just kind of a side note, but it's so fascinating that some of the fragments of the Gilgamesh story actually describe the boat and how it was built in enough detail for them to come up with some very scholarly theories on what the boat actually looked like. And it was actually a circle. And that is, again, we could spend the whole episode just talking about that. It's fascinating. But all of that is to say that Utanapishti was himself a character that witnessed the flood and lived through the flood. And Gilgamesh got him to tell the story. And then Gilgamesh brought that story back, and it was written down on clay tablets for us. So it's just this amazing link to an ancient past that like the flood story itself, proto-historical though it may be, is a very, very powerful event in our human history. And it's a really wonderful thing to think about Gilgamesh as being this link between the pre-deluge time of humanity and the after-deluge time of humanity.
Yeah, because the part of this, it is extraordinary to consider, like, what really is the meaning, which one can begin to surmise, as I do, but then it's a process of communication, because you think, is that really what it is? Because at that time there was, according to this story, Babel. We have the Babylonians, the Tower of Babel. That, in other words, it's dissent. People were not unified. And perhaps that's partly what this story is saying, that for us to be unified with our entire self, our physicality, we are a body, everything is form. Manifestation comes from thought into form. And yet, where is that substance, that ethereal, as it's called, or the void, and all these other words that we try to symbolize and understand? But yet there is this life force that is still mysterious, even though we know black holes, and even though we know macro and micro and nano and all these wonderful quantum ideas, which are extending and expanding our sense of interconnectivity. But until we become whole and we don't split our emotions, our spirit, our body, understand our body's a language, and connect to all this through dreams, yes, that perhaps there are manners of bringing us to our knees. And so even here it is Scorpio, and so possibly really opening our hearts and going into
learning
our own forest.
And learning to be like Gilgamesh and see the deep, because isn't that what Scorpio is all about, is seeing the deep, and Gilgamesh being he who saw the deep.
Yeah.
And it feels like there's so much more to talk about, so maybe we'll have to have another Gilgamesh talk in the
I want
future.
to read, absolutely. I have 4 different copies here, and I managed to read that one. It is really a lesson. Well, Susanna Lowbeer has been with us tonight. Oh, and next week, as I say, Gemini Brett. We're all amigos from the great eclipse, and thank you so very much.
Thank you so much. That's very magical. and see the deep. We'll all try. We'll try our
Okay, and
best.
we love you all. Enjoy through thick and thin. Okay. Good night.
Thank you for listening to Talk Cosmos, the show where Sue Rose Minahan and guests unveil astrology's ancient archetypes that continually build the collective experiences in our unconsciousness. Be sure to tune in next Saturday at 6 p.m. to continue finding your roots in the stars.